Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to dive into VHF radio communications. Since the beginning of time of early humans navigating on the water, communication between vessels has been an essential part of navigation. Now there's many ways that you could communicate between vessels, but the most popular and widely used is communications via a VHF marine radio. VHF stands for very high frequency, and VHF frequencies can range from 30 to 300 megahertz. VHF radio frequencies offer clear communication between vessels, but because they are a line of sight communication, it does have some limitations. And sometimes the channel that you wish to speak on can be overcrowded depending on the amount of vessels that are also communicating on that channel. Now, before we jump into the channels that you should use based on your communication needs, it's really important for you to understand how VHF radio communications work. VHF signals travel from one antenna to the other. So they're basically a line of sight communication because the radio signal travels in a straight line from one radio antenna to the other. Now, this is important for you to know because the distance between your vessel and the vessel you're trying to communicate with and the height of your antenna and the other vessel's antenna play a major part in the communication between the two vessels. So in this example, we have two vessels that are communicating. You can see that based on the distance between them, the radio signal can travel to each boat without any issues. And in this example, the two vessels trying to communicate are too far and the radio signal cannot reach between the vessels because the line of sight is blocked. Now, if you purchase a higher antenna, this can help further the distance that your radio transmission can travel. So keep that in mind when you're purchasing the antenna for your boat. Also, if you fish or you're navigating far from land where there's a limited amount of vessels and you're out of cell phone range and VHF frequency range to where other boats may be, you might want to think about purchasing a satellite phone. Now, a satellite phone works in the same fashion as a regular cell phone does, but it uses satellites to transmit your phone call or your text messages. Now, this can be extremely beneficial when you're fishing or navigating far from shore where there's a limited amount of boats and you're out of cell phone range. On our boat, I always carry my satellite phone with charged spare batteries. And this allows me to be able to place a call back home to my family if I'm going to be running late and let them know. Now, this is important, and you guys should always do this, is if you're going out on the boat, I always tell my wife the time that I'm planning on being back and the area that I'm gonna be fishing at. Now, this is important because God forbid if something ever happened to me and I don't make it back, she knows the time that I was planning on being back and the area that I was supposed to be fishing in, so that if she needed to place a call to the Coast Guard, they have a good place to start their search and rescue. Now, we all know as fishermen, we go out with a plan and that plan changes throughout the day. And having a satellite phone on the boat allows me to send a text or a quick phone call to my wife and my family to let them know, hey, I was fishing here, I'm going to be moving here and I'm going to be in this area. I'm going to get back home an hour later, 2 hours later. So they always have an idea of where I am in the ocean. Now, let's go through some basic VHF radio etiquette and do's and don'ts when using your VHF radio. Now, the first thing you want to ensure is that when you're out on the boat, that your VHF radio is on the right channel or the right frequency. There are designated channels based on the communication that you are going to have that you should be on. And don't worry, we're going to cover all of these in a minute. That way you know what channel you should be on based on the communication that you're having. Now, as a good rule of thumb, I would always recommend that when you're out on the water, you are on channel 16, which is the National Hailing and Distress Channel. Now, I always stay on channel 16 when I'm out on the water, and if I need to communicate with another vessel, we switch channels to have our communication. The reason why I always stay on channel 16 is because it is the National Hailing and Distress Channel. So if a boat needs to reach me, they could call for me on channel 16. We could agree on a working channel that we could switch to. Then we'll switch to that channel and have our communications. then I'll switch back to channel 16. Now, the reason why it's a good rule of thumb to be on channel 16 is because if every vessel was just on different channels out there on the ocean and you needed to communicate to a vessel, it would be extremely difficult to know what channel that vessel was on. And another reason why I like to stay on channel 16 is because it is the national distress channel as well. So if there's another vessel out there that has an emergency and I'm in close proximity to that vessel, I can help those people until help arrives. Always remember that when boating, safety is the #1 priority. And by being and monitoring channel 16, it allows me to be able to assist another vessel in need until help arrives. You always want to make sure that you help anybody who is in need in the ocean. The next thing that I would tell you is to always check and adjust your squelch. The squelch on the radio is going to eliminate weak signals. So this means that the higher you adjust the squelch, the more that you will further reduce those weak signals. I always like to adjust the squelch to a level of 1 to 3. So when you turn the dial, you'll stop immediately once you hear the white noise, stop. Adjusting the squelch level to a range of 1 to 3 is going to ensure that I can pick up all radio signals, whether strong or weak. When you're going to talk on the radio, make sure you press the transmit button before you start speaking. Then when you start speaking, make sure that you hold the receiver a few inches away from your lips to ensure a clear, distortion-free communication. Now, if you're in a situation where there's a lot of background noise or noise from the motors or wind if the boat is traveling, you're going to want to try to shield that. Speak below the console, duck down to try to prevent some of that noise from coming through your message. Because if you fail to do this, the recipient of your message is going to hear a lot of distortion and it's going to be very hard to make out what you're trying to communicate. When you're speaking on the VHF radio, like I said before, you want to press the button, you want to hold it away from your lips, you want to have clear, audible communication, and then when you are done speaking, you want to release the button. I know that sounds like common sense, but there's a lot of communication that I hear on a weekly basis on the VHF where people are cutting their own message off because they either start talking before they press the button or they let go of the button before they're done with their communication. Now, it is also very important that when you're done talking, you have to release the button, because remember, the way that VHF radio communications work is while you're speaking, the other person is listening, and they can't answer back to you unless the channel is open. So if you keep the button pressed on your radio, they will be unable to respond back to you. This is why it's critical that when you speak and you're done with your message, you let go of the button so that the other person can respond back to you. You also want to make sure that your communication is clear and concise. Try not to ramble, get to the point of what you're saying, release the button on the radio so that the other person can then communicate back to you. If you ramble for too long, it's going to be really hard for the other person to understand a very long communication message of what you're saying. Because if they have a question midway through your communication, they can't ask you that question until you release the button. And always, always, always remember that when you are talking, I know we talked about this, but when you're talking on the channel, and I say this because I hear it so much on a weekly basis, the people leave the button pressed. Then nobody else can use that channel because you're still engaged on that channel. So when you're done speaking, release the button. Make sure that if you don't have the clip for your radio to transmit, that you put it in a spot where the button's not going to accidentally get pressed, and then you're live on the channel and nobody else can use that channel. So very important, speak on the radio, let go of the button. Place the radio receiver in a spot where it's not going to press the button accidentally. The other thing I would tell you, and again, very basic etiquette, is never step on someone else's communication. So what this means is if somebody else is talking on that channel, don't interrupt them and start communicating with another vessel in the middle of somebody else's communication. A good rule of thumb would be to listen for a few seconds on a channel that you wish to use, just to make sure that there's not communication between two other vessels happening and you interrupt them. This is going to be especially important on channel 16. Remember that channel 16 is the national hailing and distress channel. So if you interrupt communications on this channel, you could be impeding a vessel in need of immediate assistance from the Coast Guard of communicating back and forth between the Coast Guard. Now, like I said at the beginning, VHF is a line of sight communication. And oftentimes what's going to happen on channel 16 is that you might not be able to hear the vessel that is communicating with the Coast Guard because they're out of your line of sight, but you're going to be able to hear the Coast Guard communicating back to them. So it's extremely important that you listen to the conversations that are happening on channel 16 so you're not speaking and interrupting another vessel that's in need that you might not hear that vessel, but you can only hear one side of the communication from the Coast Guard to that vessel. The other thing that I would tell you is to never communicate anything that you don't want everybody to know. Because when you're speaking on a VHF radio, the conversations between the vessels are not private. So anybody that's within a line of sight that can pick up your communication that you're having with another vessel can hear what you're saying. Then the last thing that I would tell you from a basic etiquette on the radio is never use profanity. Make sure that your conversations and communications between vessels are free of insulting words and profanity. Remember, everybody can hear what you're saying when you're talking on a VHF. Now that we got all that out of the way, let's dive into the channels that are on the VHF, what they're supposed to be used for, and this way you're going to know the channels that you could communicate on. We're going to start with channel 16. This is the hailing and distress channel. So this channel is intended to be used for safety communications and hailing for another vessel. Then, once the vessel has been hailed and communication is established between both of the vessels, both vessels will need to switch to a working channel to engage in their communication. Now remember that all vessels must monitor channel 16 when not in communication with another vessel. Channels 68, 69, 71, and 72 are reserved solely for the communication between vessels. So please remember all the do's and don'ts that we just covered when communicating on these channels. There's a lot of working vessels on the water which use these channels for communication, so you also want to be respectful no matter what channel you're communicating on. Channel 9 is a secondary calling channel, meaning this should be used to call other vessels. Now this change was created by the FCC in an effort to free up channel 16 with vessels calling each other. And this allows channel 16 to be freed up for more emergency calls. Channels 1, 7, 11, 18, 19, 63, 67, 79, and 80 are reserved for working commercial vessels only. Channel 6 is reserved for ship-to-ship safety messages and communication between Coast Guard with aircraft and search and rescue operations. Channel 24 through 28 and 84 through 88 are reserved for marine operators for conducting and sending and receiving phone calls from ship to shore. Channels 13 and 67 are known as the ship-to-ship or bridge-to-bridge channels. So these channels are used for ship communication in tight waterways and really to determine the other vessel's intentions. Channel 70 is reserved for vessels which have DSC radios to use this channel for hailing and distress calls. Now DSC stands for Digital Selective Calling, and this type of radio helps make it easier to identify and locate vessels in distress. Channel 22 is reserved for communication with the Coast Guard, and many times after their initial communication was established with the Coast Guard, they might have you switch off of channel 16 and continue to communicate with you on channel 22. Furthermore, channel 22 is where the Coast Guard gives out weather alerts. They'll communicate the weather alert on channel 16, have you switch to channel 22 to hear the weather alert that they're going to communicate or a hazard to navigation. Channels W1 through W10 are reserved for weather transmissions. For the most part, channels W1 through W4 are receiving weather transmissions from NOAA for mariners. Now, one important thing to note is that all VHF radios come with every channel. So if you see channels that we didn't cover on this list that are on your VHF radio, I would recommend to you not to use them because these channels are reserved for government use. The next thing that I want to cover are emergency distress calls. Now this is going to be important for you to know because as you're listening and monitoring to channel 16 and you hear them, you will know exactly what they mean, and hopefully you never have to place a distress call when you're out on the water. But if you ever have to place a distress call, you know exactly how to place it. This is going to ensure that all the other mariners that are monitoring and listening to channel 16 and the Coast Guard understand the nature of your emergency, and they're going to be better prepared to assist you. When you hear these safety communication or distress messages or signals coming from vessels either to the Coast Guard or from the Coast Guard to vessels, they're always going to repeat the beginning communication 3 times. And they do this to ensure that when they repeat it 3 times, it gets the attention of everybody that's monitoring that channel, and they prepare to listen. The first one is securite. This is pronounced securite. And this is used when communicating a message concerning the safety of navigation and when communicating a weather warning. The second one is pon pon. This is pronounced pon pon, or simply put, pon pon. And this is used when communicating a very urgent message concerning the safety of a vessel, an aircraft, a vehicle, or a person. These communications are reserved for very urgent communications. And the last one is probably the one that everybody's very familiar with, is Mayday. This is pronounced Mayday, and this is used for the most urgent safety communications. This means that there is a grave or imminent danger to a vessel, aircraft, vehicle, or person. A Mayday call has absolute priority over all other radio communications. Now, when you hear any of these 3 come through your VHF radio, you should immediately prepare yourself and listen to the communication that follows, because there could be a bad weather system approaching that you have no knowledge of, or there could be a concern to the safety of navigation that could pose a threat to you, or you could have a possible vessel or person in distress in close proximity to your vessel that you can further assist until help arrives. The next thing that I want to cover is how you actually place a distress call on channel 16. And I hope that nobody ever has to place a distress call. But it's important to know how to place it so that, God forbid, in the event that you ever need to communicate it, you are better prepared to know exactly how to make this communication with the Coast Guard. So let's use a Mayday call for this example, and we'll go ahead and use my vessel's name, my name. And always remember that when you're going to place a Mayday call, there needs to be grave and imminent danger to either a vessel or a person or persons on the boat. So the very first thing that you would do is open your communication on channel 16 with a Mayday call. And you want to say Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Then I would say, this is fishing vessel Pescatarian. This is fishing vessel Pescatarian. This is fishing vessel Pescatarian. Then what you would do is use the phonetic alphabet to spell out the name of the vessel. And this is going to prevent any confusion of the vessel's name to the recipients of the radio communication. So for our vessel, this would be Papa Echo, Sierra Charlie, Alpha Tango, Alpha Romeo, India, Alpha November. Then you would state your name, then you would state your location. When communicating your location, you always want to communicate the location as a latitude and longitude. Now, always keep in mind that your specific location could be obtained from the GPS unit, and a lot of the VHF radios have the lat and long on the screen of the VHF radio. Then remember, you want to ensure to have clear and slow communication so the recipient can understand your message. Then you will need to report the nature of your distress. Remember that if somebody's seriously injured, you want to communicate as much information as possible about that victim. Now, once you make this communication, the Coast Guard is going to keep an open line of communication with you on channel 16 until help arrives. They might ask you, depending on the severity of the situation that's going on, to switch to another channel so they could free up channel 16 for other emergencies, or they might even ask you, if you're within cell phone range, to give them a cell phone number and they'll communicate with you via a phone. Now, if you have a serious injury to someone on the vessel, you want to ensure that somebody is tending to that person while you are in communication with the Coast Guard. And if you're in a situation where the vessel is taken on water, the very first thing that you want to do is to ensure that everybody has their life jackets on. And if there's children on board that boat, I would highly recommend that they always keep their life jackets on. Now, I know that that was a lot of information, but now you have a great understanding of the basics of VHF communications. And I would also recommend that you take it a step further and practice this distress calling with your family or your friend, whoever goes on the boat with you, so that in the event that, God forbid, you ever need to use it, the people that are on the boat know how to communicate your distress call to the Coast Guard. Practicing this over and over with your friends and family is going to ensure that in the event that you ever need to place a distress call, they're going to be prepared to do it. Ensure that they give clear and concise communication of your location and the nature of distress to first responders and the Coast Guard so that they can be best prepared to help you depending on the nature of your distress. Now, if you want to learn more helpful boating tips, check out our Boating 101 playlist. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.